Orphan of Zhao is a play from the Chinese Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, generally attributed to the dramatist Ji Junxiang. The story delineates the distant past of Duke Ling's court in the state of Jin, roughly from 620 to 607 BCE. Zhao Dun is a high official at Duke Ling's court. His political arch-rival, General Tuangu, wins the trust of the Duke, who condones the generals eliminating the entire house of Zhao, which numbered over 300 people. Because Zhao Dun's daughter-in-law, Princess Zhuangji, is Duke's sister and is pregnant, she is thus spared. After she gives birth to a son, General Tuangu tries to kill the baby, but Cheng Ying, a family friend and physician, smuggles the newborn out. Finding his target missing and the witness is dead, Tuangu orders all newborn babies killed. To save the orphan, the physician Cheng Ying plots to give his own newborn son to General Tuangu, who immediately kills the baby. After that, the general takes Cheng Ying and his wife as his protege and adopts their son as his own, who is, now we know, the orphan of the eliminated Zhao clan. 20 years later, the orphan, now an adult, learns from Cheng Ying the truth about his own family. After some planning, the orphan seizes General Tuangu and puts him to a painful, slow death. The story has a happy ending as the orphan inherits all the titles and positions of his father and grandfather. The play is classified in the zaju genre of Chinese drama and revolves around the central theme of revenge and was the earliest Chinese play to be known and even translated in Europe. Thank you for tuning in to The Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. With me today is Dr. Patricia Sieber, Associate Professor of Chinese Literature at Ohio State University. Professor Sieber is the author of the book Theaters of Desire, Authors, Readers, and Reproduction of Early Chinese Song Drama from 1300 to 2000. She's also the lead editor of another book called How to Read Chinese Drama, a guided anthology, among other scholarly publications. Internationally, she has been involved with intercultural projects of the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Welcome, Pat.
Thanks, Claire. Glad to be here.
Well, recently, The Orphan of Zhao has become more well-known on the global stage. We're talking about 2010, when it was adapted into a film called Sacrifice by the acclaimed Chinese film director Chen Kaige. It soon got released in the Western Hemisphere after that, subtitled in English, of course, and sparked immediate controversy over its moral message. And elsewhere in 2012, it was staged as the first classical Chinese play by the Royal Shakespeare Company in Britain. And in 2015, South Korea adapted the play into a modern Korean spoken drama. All these commercial successes have truly made the play a global icon. What do you think are the possible reasons that made the play so popular on the global stage?
Right. So I think when we look at drama, we have to think about what makes drama special as a literary form. And here, I think the notion of dramatic conflict is useful. And this can take many different forms. But I think in traditional Chinese plays, they thrive on the idea that each person is trying to live up to certain ethical obligations, but these ethical obligations are often in conflict with one another. So what about the orphan in this regard? Right? So the orphan has a dramatic conflict that involves three overlapping circles of people. So one is this question of what do you owe to your biological offspring, or what do you owe to your birth parents and your extended family? In other words, the people who are, sort of part of your ancestral lineage and whom you will pay homage to. So that's one circle. And then the other circle are the social parents. So in other words, this might not be necessarily the biological or birth parents, but rather the people who raise you. And so that's another group of people. And then the third circle is, what about the people who are part of the government or the sort of political service in the broadest sense? And now orphan pulls these three circles of concern into this gripping story that is, sort of part historical drama. And it's loosely, very loosely, and we'll talk more about that, based on actual figures. It's partly a thriller. Can the orphan be saved? So, a lot of people have to do a lot of different things in order for that to happen. So this question, can it be done, hovers over this play. Then it's part who done it. So as Claire mentioned, there is this massacre, but because of the scale of this massacre, it's sort of something that is hard to be plausible or maybe believable. And so can this orphan figure out that, yes, this really happened? And if the orphan figures that out, what is he possibly going to do? And then, part of it is revenge story. How do you cope with such a gruesome family legacy? So by pulling all of these threads together, it makes for both a gripping story, but also one that is very open to different kinds of interpretations, depending on who picks it up and develops it into a play or a film or TV drama and so forth.
Right. Well, the play is not entirely Ji Junxiang's own invention, is that right?
Right. The play, like many other plays of the 13th and 14th century, had roots in the historiographical tradition. So in China, we have different forms of writing, and from the earliest moment where we have writing, history occupies a very important place. And this story was picked up in all of the major early historical sources. But even, one might say, even in that early environment, and here we're talking about the BCE era, we find that the story evolves. And for the purposes of Ji Junxiang, probably the most important rendition was the one by Sima Qian, who is sort of, I think, universally considered to be the greatest of the early historians. But having said that, we also have to be cognizant that Ji Junxiang took extreme liberties with this historiographical tradition. And so we have to be very aware that much of what we find in the play is Ji Junxiang's invention. And partly these inventions are, I think, driven by the need of the form that he was working in, that is Yuan zaju.
Could you briefly tell us what this genre is about and what The Orphan of Zhao was roughly like in its zaju form?
So zaju, like all traditional Chinese theater, is musical theater. So in other words, you have songs and you have spoken dialogue, and they alternate between one another. But it's really the songs that are the heart of the play. So in some ways, though, we can say that, yes, zaju taps into the long tradition of poetic writing in China. Again, much like the historiographic tradition, the poetic tradition in China is very old. So it builds on that tradition, but there are also some important innovations. One innovation is that traditional poetry was typically chanted and not necessarily sung. So, I mean, chanting is also a very nice sort of, rhythmic way of delivering poetic ideas and rhythm and meaning. But when you sing something, there is the music that also underwrites the emotional texture and impact of what is being said or articulated via the voice. So this musical element is very important. Then the second innovation has to do with lengths. So in other words, your most admired lyrics prior to the Yuan dynasty tended to be short poems, maybe 4 lines, maybe 8 lines, something in that order of magnitude. So in zaju, on the other hand, you have a narrative. And zaju is very indebted to a form of ballad singing, so-called zhu. And so the zhu is sort of the form that pioneered this combination of singing with narrative. And then in comes zaju, tapping into this musical and narrative structure to build a plot. The third innovation is that the poetic tradition had typically favored the voice of the elite. By elite, I mean males who were in government service in some capacity or other. And so much of the lyrical tradition is devoted to sort of the meaning of what does it mean to be sort of an upright person who has both familial obligations and public obligations. So by contrast, zaju is what we might call a popular genre. So in other words, many of the people who are at the heart of these plays are what we would call commoners. People who have no aristocratic background, who have, no family pedigrees, sort of in some ways the ordinary people or the nobodies of history. So, in other words, when you look at zaju as a genre, you find that there is a veritable social panorama of people from all walks of life who are placed, in some cases, at the center of the narrative. And there's a famous Yuan dynasty critic who actually points out that this capacity for encompassing so many different kinds of people is one of the central features of this form. So people at the time already recognized that this was a innovative aspect. And the fourth innovation is that we have somebody who is cast in the role of the main singer. And here things get a little tricky. Sometimes this main singer plays the same character for the entirety of the play. But in about a third of the extant Yuan zaju corpus, which encompasses around 160 plays, the main singer performs multiple characters. And this is the case in the Orphan. So we have the main actor is performing a general in Act 1, and then a retired Taoist / former counselor in Act 2 and 3, and then the orphan, the eponymous orphan of the title, in Act 4, or in 4 and 5, depending on the version of the play, about which we will say more. So this is, I think, a very interesting aspect of this genre, because it makes great demands on the acting professionals, because now the same actor has to perform what are often very different kinds of people. So you have this military man in the Hanjue in the first act, then you have this more sort of civil character, older person in Act 2 and 3, and then you have the orphan, this impetuous young man, who is also more on the military side of things. So this makes it imperative that this person who performs this play has broad set of acting skills to render these figures plausibly. But in terms of storytelling, what this does is that we get the story told from different points of view. So in other words, each of these figures now has one act or two acts to themselves. And so in some ways you could say it sort of acts to create a kind of history in 3D format, a stereoscopic view of what previously were just narratives. And then here, this is now enlivened by sort of the selective uptake of certain central conflicts through the lens of these individual characters. So, in other words, even though these plays are very short, that is 4 acts, sometimes with a brief prologue, interlude, or an envoy at the end, you can pack a lot of content into these brief plays. And so having this sense of history in 3D, I think, would remain one of the great attractions of traditional Chinese theater.
Well, many critics claim the most morally challenging episode to be Act 2, when our protagonist Chen Ying sacrifices his own son to guarantee the survival of his lord's son. So what kind of loyalty to another family deserves such a huge personal cost to one's own family, right? And how was this moral dilemma dramatized and highlighted through its later adaptations?
Right. So here I would say this is the most disturbing element for modern audiences. And I think I think this perhaps, on the one hand, it bespeaks our own moment where our immediate family is perhaps the sort of most important social environment, right? And of course, the state has also something to say about what we can and cannot do with our children, and harming them in any way, is something, right? Yeah. So that is really beyond the pale of the legal system, and it's beyond the pale of what modern parents could potentially imagine. So typically modern adaptations vary this part of the plot. So for example, you mentioned Cheng Haige's 2010 film, and there Cheng Yin's son dies, but it is an accident of bad timing. So in other words, he leads, he shows up too soon, thinking that his child would have already been hidden by the time that he and Duangu arrive there. So in other words, it becomes an accident rather than deliberate sacrifice. But here I want to say, chances are this was also a very disturbing element in the Yuan version. So in other words, because Ji Junxiang introduces this, right, as a new element into this story, we sort of have to ask ourselves why. Because if we look at it through the lens of sort of your stereotypical Confucian thinking, then this is also something that is complete anathema. I mean, in other words, you don't have to fast forward to the 20th century to think that sacrificing your own child is a bad idea. Because in Confucian thinking, in fact, Mencius, none other than Mencius, had said, one of the great unfilial acts is not to have a child. So in other words, you cut off the ancestral line. And so Cheng Yin, by choosing this course of action, chooses not to have an ancestral line. So, and this is not just a personal choice, right? It's also a choice for all his previous ancestors, who will now also be left orphaned, as it were. But then, okay, so why would a playwright introduce such a twist into the plot? So here, I think I would suggest there are two things happening. One is, if you look at the corpus of early drama, that is drama from 13th, 14th, 15th century, and not just zaju, but also nanxi and chuanqi, often these plays revolve around this question of how hard it is to be filial, how hard it is to be a good son, or how hard it is to be a good father. that this ideal of sort of filial love is very much embattled, because the circumstances are always seem to be there to defeat you despite your best intentions. So here I would say the fact that we see this kind of narrative twist, or you might say this particular kind of dramatic conflict between obligations to the states, but also Cheng Yin is one of the retainers of the Zhao family, right? And quite likely he's also thinking about his posthumous reception. In other words, was I on the right side of history or was I on the wrong side of history? So all of that, he has to sort of weigh against, okay, it's my child and it's also my wife's child, right? So is that now sort of a selfish decision to protect my child, or is it what historiography later on will laud as the sort of the morally upright decision? So in terms of the genre of pitting these different virtues, if you will, against one another, it really helps enhance this dramatic conflict. Now, there may be a second reason for introducing this kind of narrative detail, if you will. And that is, as noted, Sima Qian had already shifted the narrative from the aristocracy to the commoners. That is, Hanjue, Cheng Yin, Chujiu. So in other words, the sort of more ordinary people rather than the people at the elevated ranks of society. Now, when Cheng Yin offers his child, one thing we can, if we read this through the lens maybe of the discourse at the time, is that here we have an ordinary person willing to make a certain kind of sacrifice that takes great moral courage. That is sacrificing his son's life for a moral cause. And oftentimes these kinds of decisions were thought to be the prerogative of elite status. So in other words, only people who had a certain measure of social distinction were able to make hard decisions like these. But here, so commoners typically would be maybe portrayed as being selfish, greedy, small-minded. They would never do anything so grand. But here we have now a commoner who does something mind-bogglingly sacrificial for a cause. Right? He personally does not stand to benefit from this. So I think we have to read this as a cause rather than sort of his own benefit. So in some sense, then, what may seem to us as a very barbaric and unimaginable act, if we read this gesture at the level of the social symbolism in the context of that time, it might actually be a kind of quote-unquote step forward. That is to say, commoners are also capable of great moral courage.
I hope you have so far enjoyed listening to Professor Patricia Siebert's discussion on how the classical narrative form called zaju effectively enacts the moral dilemma of our protagonist Cheng Yin, who sacrifices his own son in order to save his lord's son in the famous Chinese Yuan play, The Orphan of Zhao. If you're interested in listening to the rest of the episode, in which Professor Siebert will discuss how the theme of familial revenge is placed in the context of Confucian morality and social hierarchical structure, as well as the afterlife and the cross-cultural adaptations of the play into the 21st century, you can subscribe at theglobalnovel.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.